Okay, so let's actually get to the core of what I wanted to get to tonight. All right, so let's talk about fundamental fantasy. So here's how it works. Each and every one of us has a fundamental fantasy that's operative in our lives, and yet it only works insofar as it remains unconscious. But the point is, this fundamental fantasy can also become highly oppressive, right? Because it's this dynamic that we're constantly trying to actualize and live out, and it like governs our whole life. And so here's how it works, though. They're all together. Okay, in Plague of Fantasies, Žižek says there's 7 veils of fantasy, which we could also say just 7 features or 7 structures of fantasy. And the reason they're veils is fantasy covers over something, right? It masks something. But in another essay, he provides 7 veils of fantasy, but they're not the same. So you could say there's 9 in total. If I ever got a chance to talk to him, this would be one of the things I ask him about, because in the early essay he lists 7, and then another one in the later book he has 7 again, but he's switched 2 of them out. He's got 2 new ones. Anyway, that's irrelevant. There's 4 main ones, and these are the 4 I want to talk about tonight. So here's what a fundamental fantasy does. All right, it is it's a transcendental schematism. And that, I know, that sounds like a bunch of jargon. And Žižek is using Kant's language from the Critique of Pure Reason. Now, for Kant, here's what a transcendental schematism is. For a long time, philosophers have always talked about how concepts map onto physical objects, right? So out in the world, there's trees, right? And in our mind, we have this universal concept of treeness, right? Plato would call this the form, right? The idea of tree. And so we have some universal concept of what it is for something to be a tree. The question becomes, how does the mind apply a concept to a physical object? And because for Kant, universals or concepts they're like a set of predicates, right? And predicates don't, or he also calls them rules, but it's like this list of predicates, right? It's signifiers. Well, they don't resemble the thing that they represent, right? So the question is, how do concepts get applied to physical objects? Because they seem totally different. And Kant says there's a go-between. There's a third thing, which is a transcendental schematism. And for him, the imagination has this fundamental function of it's what takes a concept and applies it to a physical object, and it does it through think of it as like a stick drawing, right? It's a little basic image of the tree. And so for him, it's like there's the list of predicates, right? There's how we linguistically define tree that make up the concept. Then there's a little sketch drawing, an image of tree, and then it's through that mediating imaginary image that it can take the predicates and apply them to objects of experience, to empirical trees. And so it's a go-between. And this is how Kant formalizes the application of a concept to a referent, to an object. So the reason Žižek says that fantasy involves a transcendental schematism is, hey, it's the idea, I have desire, right? But how the hell does desire get applied to objects of desire? Like, what is the go-between? What makes me desire certain things, right? And this is similar to objet petit a, right? The cause of desire. Well, what fantasy does is it lays out a scheme that informs me of what will give me jouissance, right? What will allow me to gain that lost object. And in doing that, that's what constitutes the particular desires I have. So the first feature of fundamental fantasy is it trains my desire to desire what it desires. That's where desire gets what it desires from. Like, oh, that if this image now that fantasy has constructed, it tells me what will satisfy desire. So that's where the particularity of my desire comes from. Because we all, there's obviously there's certain things we all have in common that we desire, but on a more idiosyncratic level, we have this particular, it's like the fingerprint of who we are is the very particularity of our desire, and that's getting informed from the fundamental fantasy. And so it's through this image, right, that desire, which for lack of a better term is like this mental thing, this mental content, like the concept for Kant, gets applied to actual physical objects. So it's serving the same function for Žižek as it did for Kant. It's the go-between. It's what applies desire to specific objects. So that's the first feature, right? The first feature is the transcendental schematism, and that tells desire what it desires. It constitutes desire. Number two is intersubjectivity. And what this means is, we talked about it earlier, right? You're never sure about what the other desires from you, and that provokes anxiety. This is Lacan's theory of anxiety, is the desire of the other. You can never master it. You can never be sure about it. And so this other aspect of fundamental fantasy is it answers this question of the other's desire. Now, Lacan uses this Italian...
Wait, are we still on the first one? On the transcendental schematism?
We're on the second one. The second one is intersubjectivity.
Okay.
And look, we're using this term. There's a whole thing about how Lacan stopped using the term intersubjectivity in his work. And it's not relevant to this point because it doesn't matter. The fact is, even though he stops using the term for particular reasons that we won't go into, the idea is basically still the same. So the second feature of fantasy is intersubjectivity, right? And what this does is fantasy is an answer to the question of the other's desire. Fantasy tells me what the other actually wants from me, right? And in doing that, it makes anxiety go away, at least momentarily, right? Like it gives me a sense of bearing, right? Like in relation to the other. And Lacan uses this Italian question, che vuoi. And che vuoi essentially means what do you want from me? Or you're telling me you want this from me, but what do you really want from me? And it conveys this anxiety-provoking dimension of the other's desire. And so this is another thing that fantasy does. It covers over the lack in the other that creates my anxiety. It fills in that lack that I can't master. It tells me what the other wants, and in doing so, it relieves me of anxiety. Okay, so that's number two.
Why is that separate from number? Okay, it seems like che vuoi was also just in the first one. What will give me jouissance? You're having your desire trained. Are we just elaborating on that by being like,
let's put it like this. The first one has to do with my desire, and the second one has to do with the other's desire.
Oh, okay.
And yes, they are intertwined, but he's separating them out, to deal with the different facets here.
Well, that seems a lot like the difference between ideal ego and ego ideal, right? Because the ego ideal would be the other's desire versus what you're trying to.
You're right. There is a parallel here between them, but we don't want to identify them because ultimately, both of these are occurring in the real, which is to say, it's not that.
Oh.
It's not that you make any this isn't occurring to consciousness. Like, none of us know what our fundamental fantasy is. Like, it's only going through analysis that any of us could. I mean, there's traces of it maybe where you can go, yeah, I can tell that I have this pattern that I'm repeating. What is it in this pattern that keeps me going back to it, right? There's a sense that we can get a kind of awareness of it, but to really get a sharp image of what the fundamental fantasy is would require analysis. And so it's not something that we're aware of at the egoic level, and it's not so much. I mean, there is a symbolic component insofar as, yeah, you can make sense of the fundamental fantasy once you discover it in analysis, right? It has all three, but more than anything, the fundamental fantasy is unconscious, and therefore it's in the real, right? It's
Gotcha.
not that, conscious egoic awareness has access to, nor even pre-conscious, like symbolic awareness. Like it's not even something that you have some pre-conscious identification with.
Right. Okay. So that's important.
Yeah. And so, okay. So number one, just make that clear. Fantasy constitutes my desire. It tells my desire what to desire in order to get the jouissance it's chasing, right? On the other hand, and this is the most important one of the two, is the intersubjectivity thing, where it answers the question of the other's desire, because my desire is being based off the other's desire, right? The other's desire is still primary, and it always is primary for LACAN. Desire is always the desire of the other. So feature 2 is more primary than the first one. I mean, maybe Žižek should have reversed them in order, but the point is, it's like, okay, yeah, maybe it works better. Think about it like this. All right, I have this anxiety-provoking, experience with the enigma of the other's desire. I don't know what the other desire wants from me. Totally creates anxiety. I come up with an image, right, of what the other desires, and in doing so, it tells my desire what to desire. Because I desire the desire of the other. I want the other to desire me, and that pretty much involves me desiring also what the other desires. I know it's like this. We just keep saying this phrase over and over again, but
we use the
it has many meanings in it, so you have to keep saying it differently to bring out those various meanings.
Every parent or person who's ever babysat or like worked with children in any way knows that there is a fundamental thing about the desire of the other always in play, because like kids will either love or deeply resent that you're interested in something that's not what they're working on already, right? Like if a kid is playing with some toy and you're interested in something else, then they're gonna like the kid's entire like activity, whether they're being very distracted and completely doing other stuff at that point or whatever, it's always a kind of a respect to that. And also, like, think about it, like there could be a million toys in a room and the kids are all like just doing whatever, but as soon as like this one kid fixes on this one toy and it's just like this toy, then all the other kids want that toy.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
It's desirable precisely because it's desired. And so, okay, so the third feature, right? Žižek calls this the narrative occlusion of antagonism. But
Nice.
What it means, we can just leave that out. What it really means is that fantasy is always a kind of narrative. There's always a story aspect to it. And even though we don't have immediate access to like the bare bones fundamental fantasy that's operative in our unconscious, we are aware of our daydreams, right? We always catch ourselves daydreaming. Interesting thing here, right? Most of us have no problem when we have a dream one night, waking up the next day and telling our friends and family about the dream. It's always fun. Oh, I had this weird dream last night. Let me tell you about it, right? What we won't do is tell people our daydreams. Hell no. You never see somebody, oh, let me tell you about what I was just daydreaming about, what I was just fantasizing about. It's completely off limits. And so our daydreams or our fantasies, in a sense, have a much more intimate connection to our fundamental fantasy. And even if they're not the fundamental fantasy, and they in some way have that fundamental dynamic operative within them. And so that's why none of us are willing to discuss our fantasies and daydreams with other people. It's like the most intimate core of our being. And the thing with our daydreams is that they usually are little stories or little sequences of events, right? And what Žižek is getting at with this third feature is fantasy is a story that covers over an antagonism or a deadlock. And what he means by that is there's some sort of impossibility, like, right, okay, like I can never fully enjoy, right? That's a deadlock within me. Like I'm always chasing this kind of phantasmatic primordial jouissance, and yet I can't ever get it. But it covers over that antagonism, that deadlock, that impossibility, and it gives me a little sketch, a little like a script to live out that tells me this is how I'll get the enjoyment. So the thing is, there's all kinds of personal deadlocks. There's like these built-in tensions in our lives, in our libidinal economies, in our psyches, and we all have specific ones to us. And fundamental fantasy covers over them, makes them go away in the phantasmatic realm. And it gives us a story that makes sense of this, right? So this narrative aspect of fantasy basically covers this narrative, this diachronic story, beginning, middle, end. It has a way of concealing a structural deadlock, something built in that we can't get rid of, we can't do anything about. Now, here's the thing. Some of this seems vague, right? I'm going to come back and I'm going to give examples for each one of these that will help make sense of what's going on with them. So the fourth one that we're going to talk about, Žižek calls it after the fall. But what it essentially means is that fantasy always stages castration. So we've talked about castration, symbolic castration. This is where you lose the jouissance that you posit that you once had, but you didn't really have it. But it's when prohibition comes in and you have to sacrifice, basically living for immediate gratification. And this is like the first traumatic loss or lack the child has to integrate into itself, right? LACAN calls it the bedrock of castration. Like, so much of our lives go back to us feeling like we lack something. Like I couldn't satisfy my partner and we broke up, and it boils down to how you think what you lacked, right? You lacked money, or you lacked enough emotional openness, right? There's all kinds of things that you can lack, and we're always in some way, shape, or form suffering because of lack. And it's like, that's what the whole thing about desire is. Desire is always this pursuit of that which will do away with lack, with what castration caused. Fantasy, as we're seeing, is a way of staging it and making sense of castration. And so that's part of it. When you think about your particular fantasies or your daydreams, think about how often they have some sort of traumatic scenario going on in them. I mean, you can take, the most generic kind of fantasy, like the damsel in distress, right? Well, distress, the woman in distress. And of course, the man, the masculine fantasy, of course, is that I have enough fullness, right? I don't lack. I'm the knight in shining armor. I have the power, and I can show up and I can fill in the void. I can fill in her lack because I overflow with power, with vitality, with presence. And so much of our fantasy life is about who has, it sounds too abstract to talk about presence and absence, but it's, I have that which you lack, or I am that which you lack, right? It's all these different kinds of dynamics related to lack and filling in the lack in the other. And so...
Really quick, so you'd say 4 is called what?
4, okay, Žižek calls it after the fall, right? Because he's talking about the biblical fall, right? The fall is you've lost something, right? You've lost the enjoyment you had in Eden, so your enjoyment has been cut off. You've been symbolically castrated by God, right? Adam and Eve. And so he calls it after the fall, but I think it's better to call it the staging of castration. So again, when you think about your daydreams or your fantasies, there's usually some traumatic lack that's going on, right? Somebody needs to show up and save the day, or somebody has that which this other person doesn't have, right? There's always some lack that's going on, and there's usually a scenario that explains what caused the lack, right? It could be some fantasy involving, an oppressive government, right? Or whatever. It's usually explaining why you lack, or why the other you care about lacks. It's giving a narrative to lack, which for most of us, again, we don't realize that this deep sense of lack that we have, we don't realize that it comes from just the basic prohibitions involved in becoming socialized. We think it has this mysterious presence to us, right? We can't figure out this feeling of lack inside of us, and that's what fundamental fantasy helps to do. Is it helps to explain where it gives a narrative, a staging to this lack. So here's the thing. All of that, those are the four main features of fundamental fantasy. Now let's go through and see how this works in an ideological context. Okay, and so here we're going to use Nazism. This is Žižek's preferred example. And so here's what happens. Okay, so let's go back to the first one. Transcendental schematism, the constitution of desire. Well, you ask yourselves, what did the Nazis desire? Well, they desired the death, non-existence, removal of the Jews, right? That was the basic desire they had. So then you ask yourself about the second feature, right? Kvoy, the mysterious desire of the other. Then we contextualize it. The average German, the society's in a state of decline, and they see that their nation is in a state of perplexity. They see that the people around them are scared and lacking, and so the person's asking themselves, what does the other want from me? Like, what does the German nation desire of me? Who am I supposed to be for my parents, for my friends, for my colleagues, right? All of this is operative. And so, the intersubjective aspect is, what does the German nation, including the people I personally know, what do they desire of me? And so, obviously, you would go, well, they desire for me to help. They desire for me to do whatever I can to fix the problem. But again, we go back retroactively to the first one, and it's saying, oh, okay, I need to help, defeat the Jews. It giving an answer to that mysterious desire of the other, both nation and your personal relationships with people, right? So then the third one, the narrative occlusion of antagonism, right? So what does fantasy, it takes a structural deadlock and it gives it an image, which is to say it gives it, an empirical figure, right? It gives it something that you can perceive. And so what was going on at the time? Well, capitalism was in a state of crisis, and capitalism was ultimately the cause of what was going on in Germany with all of its structural dynamics. But all of that kind of antagonism, you can't get a grip on that kind of structural impossibility or structural deadlock. It's too much to process. And so what you do is you convert a structural problem into an empirical figure. And so instead of this, impossible to perceive structural deadlock, right, all of the dynamics of capital, you take that and exchange it for an empirical scapegoat figure, right? Now things make sense. Now I have a narrative.
This is the occlusion. What's the word occlusion mean, really quick?
Well, it's like a blockage, a narrative blockage of antagonism. But the way I read Žižek is he's saying that it covers, this is where a story with all of its imagery covers over structural antagonism, structural deadlocks, right? Like, think about how Marx talked about the contradictions of capital, right? Those are not empirical reference. Those are structural dynamics that you can't perceive with your eyes. And so when, human beings in general, we especially Americans because of our ideology, but human beings in general have trouble with structural dynamics. It's much easier to just, the problem is something I can perceive with my senses. And, this is why scapegoating is so easy to do for people, because systematic problems are way more complicated than just being able to point your finger at some group and go, them right there, right? But here's the catch, is that if you do that, if you do this scapegoating, it relieves so much perplexity and anxiety, because now you're not dealing with these invisible structural dynamics. Now it's got an image. Now it's something that you can perceive. And that's what relieves, right? It covers over these structural dynamics in exchange for an empirical figure. The point is, it's all phantasmatic. It's all made up. The phantasmatic Jew does not correspond to actual Jews. And so the Jew is really just the product of the Nazi imagination. It doesn't have anything to do with actual Jewish people. And this is why, because you can always find a scapegoat, right? Every society, we see this in America right now, whenever there's structural problems occurring, there's always some group that they can fit into this scapegoat position to relieve them of anxiety and perplexity, right? It makes them feel better, because things become a whole lot simpler when you do this through fantasy. And so this is how fantasy is operative at the ideological level. And fourth, right, the after the fall, staging of castration. Again, this has to do with staging the loss, staging the lack, right? Well, before, it's like you don't know what take the contradictions in capital, right, and all the dynamics in capitalist society leading up to World War II, right? You can't explain all of that. You can't get a hold of that. But if you stage it, if you narrativize, if you give it a narrative or a story, then you can go, what caused us German people to lose our enjoyment? The Jewish plot, right? The Jewish people. And now castration has a narrative, right? Now it explains why you lack. And so all four of these together, you see how strong these four dynamics in fantasy are when it comes to racism and scapegoating and ideological fantasy, because they take all of this anxiety and perplexity and impenetrability and give it all an answer, right? This is why people get so fucking invested in their ideological fantasies, because their sense of having, understanding, a familiarity with what's going on, being able to, the term Frederick Jameson uses that Žižek always uses as well, is cognitive mapping, right? Okay, there's all this shit going on in society. I can't begin to understand any of it, but what these ideological fantasies do is give us a cognitive mapping. It explains what I should desire. It explains what the other wants from me. It tells me a story that transforms all of these structural dynamics into an image that I can get a grip on, that I can perceive, and it explains why we're all lacking or suffering in the first place. And like ideologies, especially Nazism, is built on this ideological fantasy. And this is where these kind of things, people are willing to die and kill for these kind of fantasies. And so this is why it's so important to understand this stuff, especially in the times we're living in, where the point is, this ideological fantasy didn't refer to anything in reality. It's just about a nightmare the Germans were having, right? And they're having this complicated social nightmare, and they couldn't process it. So here we come, and here's a fantasy that makes sense of all of it. And but the fantasy, that's the point. The veils of fantasy, they totally cover over. They totally distort actual reality.
Like, so one would be, what will give me jouissance? Well, a feeling of respect, power, and fullness. What does the other want of me? To become a hero. Like the soldier, because in Soviet Russia it was the worker, and in Germany, Nazi Germany, it was the soldier, right? The heroic soldier, and that was, and you could run the Soviet Russian ideology just through as well, you get the same kind of thing, right? But because the basic way this sets up works for almost every ideology, probably every ideology. But anyway, so insofar as it's successful and works for normies within a population, it's going to have to be able to play off of these things, right? And so, yeah, so this is, Nazis are just like the most mask off about it, and it's like so obviously delusional and immature, right? But okay, so respect, power, fullness. Oh, I have to become the hero. The hero's journey. Once again, Jung. And then, so what do you need though? You need a scapegoat. And they stole our pride / power / fullness. There you go. And I'm using
you want to draw the parallel, right?
Yeah.
So with Soviet Russia, so it's not the intrinsic deadlocks built into the state bureaucracy. It's just counter-revolutionaries.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
You exchange a symbolic or a structural deadlock for an empirical referent.
We interrupt this conversation for a quick message from our sponsors.
You may recognize this conversation from the past because it is actually a piece of a longer live stream. So what I've done is I've edited the conversations I had with Mikey down into smaller chunks, and I will be releasing those serially until the launch of the Slavoj Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do course, taught by Michael Downs and myself. I will be asking him the questions and hystericizing him, along with a cohort of people who will be joining us live and in the forums as we do a close reading of what Slavoj Žižek claims is his most important theoretical work, more important than sublime objective ideology by far. He said that if you don't have anything to say about For They Know Not What They Do, then keep silent when it comes to sublime objective ideology. But we don't just do close, thorough, hardcore readings. We also have some more introductory stuff. And so if you go to theory-underground.com/events, then you'll be able to see the dates of all of the upcoming events. You see that the Idea of the University, taught by myself, Brian, and a couple of educators who are very close to me. And we wanted to focus on Karl Jasper's short work, The Idea of the University, as a way to start the year, but it's also a way for Theory Underground to get off on the right track. January 25th is the Professional Managerial Class Consciousness course that I'm co-teaching with Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia podcast. And then in February, on the 25th of February, launches Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do. Mikey has spent 2 decades getting himself to the point where he feels confident enough to teach this book. And I think that humility and effort that he's put in is something that we can all learn from. I mean, come on. He's like our own homegrown Žižek. He's like our own national treasure. I think that we really ought to uplift him and give credit where it's due, not just take him for granted and act like, we don't need to. So that's a part of the reason actually why I really appreciate Brian Becker from Singularity Sublimity podcast. He's done a lot of amazing teaching work himself. A lot of people read the blog and then don't give credit where it's due. And that would be fine if he had a cushy academic career with tenure and all that. But he doesn't. He's working in a warehouse, supporting his mom. We need to hashtag free Mikey from wage labor so that he can spend more time doing what his passion is, which is teaching philosophy and theory, writing books. That's what we want. More of these kinds of conversations. Make it possible. Make a donation. 5, 15, 20, 50, 100. Make the donation today. Please. It means a lot. Words are cheap. Money? That's where it matters. Get your skin in the game. Show Mikey you care. I hope that we'll get to do a lot more of this in the near future. And then the last thing, I'm doing a countrywide tour this year. I will be on the East Coast, I will be on the West Coast, and I will be everywhere in between. So if you want me to come to your town or city, email me. It's down below. If you want to volunteer, be a part of the street team, host or guide while we're there, let me know. I hope to be in a city near you sometime this year, and I hope that you'll take one of my classes. Thanks.